So I don't have any app just to control the time. Or do you want maybe? I thought I can put the. So as soon as I finished, when you start, because it's it will be kind of a lot. So I think here Jukka, can you have? Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. Today it's a great pleasure for me just to introduce you to Professor Jukka Husu. Jukka Husu is a professor of teaching and teacher education at the University of Turku in Finland, where he works in contact with the Center for Learning Research. Previously, he was an acting professor of teacher education at the University of Helsinki and worked as a primary teacher, teacher educator, and researcher for several years. Since 1995, he has been an active ISATT visitor and a contributor for the association. His research focuses on teachers' pedagogical knowledge, reflection, and ethical judgment in teaching. Throughout his work, he emphasizes the need for incorporating these areas of knowledge and skills into teacher education programs. Dr. Husu has published extensively in international refereed journals and books. He's a member of the editorial board of Teaching and Teacher Education. Currently, Dr. Husu is co-editing the forthcoming Handbook of Research of Teacher Education together with Jean Clandinin, published by ISATT. You also have flyers outside of this room. Thank you very much, Dr. Jukka Husu. Please take the floor. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And I was just remembering, it was 22 years ago when I first attended the ISATT conference where it was in Canada. And now, so time flies, and the times they are changing too. So, as Jean, my colleague and friend, spoke yesterday in her keynote speech, how I approach my topic today is largely based on what I have learned from working with her, editing the SAGE Handbook of Research on Teacher Education. During those 3 years, we nurtured each other's ideas of teacher education, particularly how to integrate the many things doing and researching teacher education, but also how to seek out new ways how it would be possible to educate teachers, and especially how research on teacher education can help us to see and develop new ways of doing teacher education. As Jean noted yesterday in her keynote speech, our ideas became interwoven over these 3 years' time in ways that I also find quite challenging to talk about scholarship of integration and scholarship of disruption without acknowledging that it was in those so many conversations we were sharing with Jean and in our writings that we began to develop the possibilities of two kinds of scholarships, scholarship of integration and scholarship of disruption, and how the two scholarships would help us further in research on teacher education. We wanted the handbook to have a strong international focus. This focus on including research from many international contexts and addressing researchers from multiple countries, we hope would allow us to promote teacher education scholarship that we hope to be relevant in many teacher education contexts. We were aware of the great variety across the countries in teacher education approaches, selectivity, curricular demands, state policies, and the role of research in teacher education. However, we saw this great diversity as a source of insight to find new ways to address challenges of teacher education. In the midst of this great variety, we see greater coherence, but not uniformity, in research on teacher education. As Jean yesterday noted, we were fond with Bob Bullow's idea that he wrote in a review, another handbook, where he said that a collection of articles does not make a handbook. To make his point, Bullow drew on what Boyer characterized as the scholarship of integration. The scholarship of integration involves doing research at the boundaries where fields converge, and it also means interpretation, fitting research into larger intellectual patterns. Like most of us, I think we kind of understood what integration could mean. You take plenty of research on a certain topic on a table, read and analyze that pile of research carefully, and try to understand what may connect those individual pieces of research. Taken together, in what ways do the findings relate to each other? What do the findings mean? I think review studies are familiar to us as they include conceptualizations, interpretations, and syntheses of larger bodies of academic work. In this vein, we were hopeful that how we conceptualized the handbook could offer something new to the scholarship of integration in the research of teaching, and also could show ways forward for new lines of scholarship. During the process, we began to see that we also needed to break away from those increasingly bigger and more inclusive pictures that we were creating, or trying to create. Often implicitly, we sense that we need to create a rupture or a crack in taken for granted ways of seeing teacher education and the research on it. The ideas around scholarship of disruption seemed somewhat new as we held it against the scholarship of integration. So we saw ourselves as working to create scholarship of integration, a scholarship of interruption, and finally to work a dialectic between these two scholarships. We hope that the handbook would allow us to work in those combined ways. And we saw the handbook as an arena where we could explore a scholarship of integration as well as to open up possibilities for the scholarship of disruption. We agreed with Bob Bullow that handbooks should offer ways for further scholarship of integration. Those engaging in integration drew attention to the boundaries of teacher education and, if possible, try to push them a bit further. Integration means creating and discerning larger intellectual patterns that may be at work in a particular research field. This dual focus on attending to the boundaries and outstretching them and creating larger intellectual patterns meant that we were making bigger and more inclusive interpretations as we were working with a handbook. We have many times referred to Boyer's idea of the scholarship of integration. Actually, integration is one of the 4 domains of scholarships that Boyer advocated. For the purposes of research on teacher education, the 4 scholarship domains link together and they make a whole. The process starts with discovery. It speaks of the commitment to knowledge and active inquiry. Discovery contributes not only to knowledge, but also to the intellectual climate where discoveries are made. Boyer emphasized that not just the outcomes, but the process, and especially the passion, give meaning to the effort. Discovery asks, what is to be known? What is yet to be found? Discovery makes it necessary to put evidence into perspective that illuminates and reveals its significance. As Jean and I have already emphasized, the scholarship of integration gives meaning to the isolated facts. We know this activity also as contextualization, organization, or synthesis. Through integration, knowledge extends by making new connections, and these connections, in turn, open doors to new fields of inquiry. Integration includes interpretation, which means fitting research into larger intellectual patterns. It asks, what do the findings mean? Here Boyer argued for the necessity for the multidisciplinary perspectives and cross-disciplinary investigations. These large inquiries can provide broader perspectives and help us to move over traditional and already specialized disciplinary categories. Underlying this view, we can recognize his belief, Boyer's belief, on the connectedness as a fundamental issue in research. As he argued, the connectedness of things is what the educator or researcher contemplates to the limits of his capacity. Thus, articulating the scholarship of integration is not simply a way to expand an appropriate knowledge. It also means an avenue to challenge ourselves as researchers. However, even the larger and integrated intellectual patterns do not automatically fit into practice. The scholarship of application takes into account how academic knowledge can be relevant to wider context and be applied to consequential problems. This scholarship naturally embraces teacher education, and it is an integral part of its academic service. Boyer remarked that application does not suggest that knowledge is first discovered and then applied. The process is more dynamic and emphasizes the connection between the interests of scholarship and those of a society. He imagined the research community not only to responding social problems, but also allowing those problems to define an agenda for engaged scholarship. The scholarship of application draws on the virtues of service. It means developing one's own expertise on the best of others. In teacher education, for student teachers is learning, but also for the collegial professional development in our teacher education communities. It relates to the issues of equity and fairness and seeks to ensure that places of teacher education both lead in and are attentive to matters of social justice and other areas where change is needed in schools and in our societies. The fourth scholarship domain, scholarship of teaching, takes application further in particular direction and is useful for both researchers, now in the role of teachers, and students alike. Being able to teach what one is researching is vital, because teachers bring the depth of their disciplinary knowledge to the task of transforming and extending their students' learning. Being able to do that, teaching requires adopting and developing appropriate methods and approaches to achieve its goals. The scholarship of teaching advocates the collaborative dynamic of teachers and students, both as learners. It promotes engaging students as active learners and endorses bringing critical approaches and attitudes of a function of learning. In all, teaching in teacher education contains scholarships that works in close connection with scholarship of discovery, integration, and application, and also in some way summarizes our many aims in the handbook. As we planned the handbook, we felt important to keep our minds on teacher learning. What and how teachers learn or can learn their professional knowledge and skills during teacher education and develop their professional competencies during their hopefully long teaching careers. We began by identifying enduring problems or puzzles in teacher education. What we meant by these enduring puzzles were those issues that concerned us researchers in teacher education. We saw also these larger puzzles shaping more practical issues in teacher education, such as practical issues and field experiences. We used these enduring issues to identify 9 sections in our handbook. The sections can also be seen as spaces of learning, and we also titled them accordingly. We realized that there may be others, and also perhaps more pressuring enduring problems and puzzles, but this seems most important to us at the time we were making the handbook. We then drew on different theoretical approaches used in research on those learning spaces in order to give a better understanding of what we can learn from the results they provide. Using different theoretical frames as connective tissues, we aim to come to grips with how a particular theoretical frame derives research tasks, positions research in different contexts, and bring a different set of interpretations to understand and develop those areas of learning in teacher education. We try to develop a sense of narrative coherence across the sections, as we began with issues of teacher identity as a beginning point in teacher education. Professional agency in teacher education means perceiving oneself as an active and intentional expert who makes decisions and reflects on the impact of one's actions. It means developing one's own expertise for the best of others, especially for the candidate's own learning, but also for their shared professional development. There is a strong consensus in the field of teacher education that teaching is inherently a moral endeavor. And this central aspect of teaching should also be exposed and developed during teacher education. However, we still do not fully understand the phenomena and how it's articulated in the practice of teaching. Thus, there is a need and a demand for research on moral work on teaching as well as the moral work on teacher education, how we can promote these aspects in teacher education with our students. We can frame teachers as agents of social change and correspondingly see teacher education programs as needing to prepare teachers to do this kind of work. So working on the political, social and cultural frameworks call for creating more democratic classrooms, but also more democratic classrooms in teacher education. and search for situated understandings in those many places. The section of learning through pedagogies in teacher education shows how different pedagogies in teacher education are connected to particular ways of teacher learning. It is about ways of teaching in teacher education. As we know, there are multiple ways of organizing pedagogical practices that can be shaped by different theoretical views. As a result, teaching and how it supports learning is never simply an instrumental activity, a question of just a technique or a method. There is a vast amount of research that has starting points on the subject matter areas of teacher education that specify essential knowledge and skills in those subject matter areas. And these are often seen as a core of teacher education and as starting points for teacher education programs. The concept of competencies, with its meaning of being competent in a skill or area of knowledge, has been much used in teacher education, and not only on competence-based teacher education programs. In order to make a clearer distinction between outcome behaviors and competencies, we felt that it was important to promote understanding that competencies can also be seen as integrated bodies of learning professional knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And as such, competencies represent a potential for behavior, not just the behavior itself. Assessment, in a sense, how teacher educators assess teacher candidates during teacher education, is an important issue. It matters because assessment practices largely determine what and how teacher candidates are learning during teacher education. For example, as teacher candidates are selected in teacher education programs, what assessments are used to select candidates? And during teacher education, what assessment measures are used in order to evaluate teacher candidates' development of learning towards the aims of teacher education? We ended with a section devoted to learning of teacher educators. As Linor Hayder and David Brody, one of our authors in that section, stated, teacher educators' role in preparing the next generation of teachers is at the heart of this educational enterprise. They hold much responsibility for the success and quality of teacher education programs. As we worked our way through conceptualizing and constructing the handbook, we intended doing research at the boundaries of fields that would also lead to disruptions. The need to reopen, to reconsider, and to reimagine the boundaries of research on teacher education. We wondered what fields should come together in the boundaries of teacher education research, and what are the fields that should bound teacher education research. The way we developed our learning spaces, and in the inclusion of authors from different theoretical standpoints, methodological commitments, and different contexts, we try to create possibilities for tensions to help us understand in deeper ways research on teacher education. So during the making of the handbook, we recognized that in order to get further, we need some tools or concepts to cut down those bigger pictures in doing the handbook we were making, and also dominating our thinking and ways of seeing and doing teacher education. As Jean yesterday quoted Leonard Cohen, and along with Cohen's idea and lyrics, we saw our work as discerning or creating cracks in teacher education to allow some new light in. or we have disappointed, we have not seen the light. Sorry to say. Throughout the process, editing the handbook, we found Maxine Green's thoughts helpful as she encouraged us to think about those spaces between that create the possibility of looking at things as they could be otherwise. Green suggested using research on teacher education not to merely support the status quo or to make changes so small that leave teacher education mostly unchanged. Nor does she recommend us to be too radical to overthrow the ways teacher education is implemented nowadays. Rather, she advises us to look both ways, that is, in ways that allow us to see both present and future opportunities that help us to imagine new possibilities to move on. Disruption can be defined as interruption, the flow or continuity or break. Also the Oxford Dictionary at least says. And the concept of disruption has been applied in many fields, in technology and education, also in business, to mark innovation and change. The experience of disruption takes us through a process of exploration and meaning-making. In disruption, we contemplate how far into the in-space between we are willing and able to go. These in-between spaces are similar to what John Dewey spoke about uncertainty and invite us to a stance of inquiry. What does it mean to be disrupted, recognizing that new things may be happening at the research edges? What new understandings, decisions, and actions are made possible in the experienced disruptions? Disruption is often understood as being a negative experience, a failure, not fitting into expectations, and going against the grain. But it can also be unexpected and open unknown horizons. Through reflection and deconstruction of the research, we may be able to move from perceiving disruption from negative to new discoveries. There are places of tensions, places that ask us to stop and inquire, to engage in wondering what it means to do research on teacher education. As we attend to the boundaries where fields converge, tensions are usual. Rather than smooth them over, we can try to identify the tensions and use them as ways to disrupt the taken for granted, to see them as cracks or breaks that can let us think and try anew. This relates to disruptive issues and events themselves. Understanding disruptive issues and experiencing them can vary a lot, as they do not come from the same sources. Often, disruption can happen when the choices that once were successful may become those that will weaken the future success. Put simple, disruption happens when you are doing the same in your own box and too long. After many successful years, our research may not meet the demands we are facing now or in the future, and outside our research and publishing boxes. This is quite human and natural and allows us to see disruption as a phenomenon that easily happens to everyone. It is important to note that this doesn't mean incompetence. More often, it relates to satisfaction and enjoyment of repeatedly doing the same things and topics that have been effective. The script is that we continue on the path that already has brought us success. The problem can arise from our narrow-minded or outdated focus of doing research. A problem can arise if we are not flexible enough to transition our research into new directions. Whatever the reasons may be, the research we do may not meet well enough the demands it is intended to serve outside our research communities. However, disruption can also arise from inside sources in ways that we, together with our organization, are not able to answer and supply disruptive events and issues we have noticed. We know that innovations are difficult to adopt and demand solid work and open minds because disruptions often involve considerable changes throughout the organizations. Small changes in isolated parts do not make the needed change. Teacher education requires many people in many places with special skills and training to do that education. No one could build, for example, constructivity-based teacher education or care-based teacher education by her or by himself. Only an entire team of educators can build them. To do so, every teacher educator in the organization has to work on improving the needed quality, the needed knowledge and skills in his/her position. But educators can never operate purely independently. At some point, knowledge and skills must be generated in ways that establishes how individual skills and competencies are linked and how they work together. Teacher education requires shared knowledge and skills that conveys how all the pieces in an organization fit together. These connective tissues are often hard to find and develop. Perhaps for this reason, teacher education institutions find it often compelling to supply what particular disruptions would demand them to do. So, guided with these notions of integration and disruption, we try to forecast possible cracks or disruptive events, where they might happen in teacher education research and what they might entail for research for teacher education practices. Working with a dialectic between integration and disruption, we try to make visible gaps and tensions at the boundaries of research. And in this way we hope to recognize some new ways forward for research on teacher education. Now, I will try to outline some thoughts about learning in teacher education and how research can help us to see ways to move ahead. I now reflect my disruptive understandings, that may also be perhaps shared with Jean, of the possible cracks, both new and already known, facing research on teacher education. I will now identify 4 cracks or breaks that hopefully can let some new light in or make the lights that are already on even brighter. I will start with the background of teacher education research. As we reviewed the chapters, we were reminded that keeping our research focus only and too closely on the learning of children in classrooms keeps hidden the central importance concerning the learning of student teachers and teacher educators. We saw that too close focus on school classrooms as the major sites of learning and students as the only learners was problematic. Already one of our handbook draft reviewers reminded us that we should be clear in our focus on teacher education, not teachers and teaching in general. And reviewing and reading the many chapter versions brought us back to this issue. We often found ourselves writing to the authors, asking them to keep their focus more clear on teacher education and the research on teacher education, and making stronger contributions to them. Crossman and MacDonald have highlighted the importance to attend what counts as the fields of research on teaching and what counts as the field of research on teacher education, as well as to attend how the two research fields are related to each other. We think that too often research just explores the factors, even outside teacher education, and how those factors may influence on teacher learning, rather than researching what constitutes teacher learning during teacher education. Perhaps we should concentrate more on researching entities that change while with learning and the processes that result in those changes. Along with these thoughts and throughout our work, we became convinced that we should be clearer on what is research on teacher education. While we intended to keep research on teaching and research on teacher education more in separate, we wondered if it's important to consider other fields of research which also converge at the boundaries with research on teacher education. What becomes visible if we loosen the tight coupling with the research of teaching and the research on teacher education and began to consider other fields of importance? What broader crossings should we do then? As Auli Thum, one of our section editors, noted, while it is now broadly accepted that teachers are the most important influence on students' learning, and that teacher quality is the key determinant to successful student learning, it is surprising that there does not exist more research focusing on the learning or the assessment of the learning of these key competencies, also in wider sense key competencies, during teacher education. This is a highly important notion, because without close attention to teachers as learners across the country of teacher education, we may also fail to recognize the importance of creating schools and classrooms as sites for teachers' continuous professional development and learning. In order to promote better teacher learning during teacher education, we need to collaborate with scholars and practitioners, who are often the same, hopefully, to develop common language for describing how teachers learn to practice in teacher education. And also in line with MacDonald and her colleagues, we think that we do not need to develop lockstep rules for how to prepare teachers to enact key practices during teacher education. Rather, we think that we would benefit more from a simple frameworks that would be applicable across the many contexts, and that will also allow us to learn more from each other. While we call for core practices or key practices, we strongly emphasize that student-teacher learning during teacher education means a wide spectrum of professional areas and practices. For example, Dawe Bayer, our section editor, raises important questions around teacher learning as he wonders if it's necessary to do a specific identity work in teacher education, or must teacher education in essence be built around identity development itself, where identity is not only a learning outcome, but simultaneously an ongoing learning process as well. Lili Orlan Barak, in her section introduction and our tomorrow keynote speaker, picks up the importance of attending the student-teachers' learning of professional agency during teacher education. Teacher agency is tightly connected to broader values and commitments of profession, while continuously unfolding in everyday teaching activities, as Anna Edwards, one of our section authors, reminds us. And she calls the need to prepare future teachers to function as transformative agentic teachers who maintain a strong connection with collectively sustained professional values about learners and society in order to continuously form and reform teaching. As these examples show, many learning areas are hugely extensive and complex, and the focal challenge for the research on teacher education is how student teachers are able to integrate them in a way that their full potential can emerge in their future classroom actions, and how we can help them. Investigating student-teacher learning during teacher education context is important, or should I say, it is the most important task of research on teacher education. This is not to say that there hasn't been research on this area, because there is a growing body of work also done within the ISATT by its executives and members. For example, John Loughran, Tom Russell, Gerd Geltermans, just to name a few. And also browsing this year's conference program confirms the strong commitment for this important learner focus. But we need more research in the future. As noted, student teachers learn in the context of teacher education program in which they are involved. The ways in which teacher education is organized and the pedagogies and assessment practices that are used in the program influence the capabilities with which student teachers enter into the profession. This implies that we must pay close attention not only to teacher education curriculum, but also to the pedagogies of teacher education. How learning to teach and learning to educate should be best accomplished and supported is largely the question of pedagogies used in pre- and in-service teacher education, as Juan Jomena notes in his section introduction. And he underlines the task of pedagogies of teacher education to organize knowledge, skills, and experiences in order to understand practice and to take up the challenges in learning teaching in teacher education. Juanjo's focus is on the learning of teachers as they take up the task of teaching. The pedagogies teacher educators enact to support student teachers need to be investigated and analyzed much more thoroughly. This is important because if we continue to develop and identify learning of teacher competencies and practices without simultaneously considering how we will prepare teachers to enact those practices, our implementation will likely fail. In addition to loose framework for learning in teacher education, the research should also provide an identified set of pedagogies that can be used and tested in teacher education programs in various contexts. Building a common language and a framework for aggregating pedagogical knowledge and tools may also help us to learn more easily from each other. So the fourth crack. We know that many are trying to push into different ways of doing teacher education. Therefore, we ask authors to raise their critical voices. However, as we completed the handbook, we were somewhat surprised that many chapters that espoused a more critical edge do not move into their ways in which their critical edges are lived out and applied in teacher education practices. This one-sided and divided view can be described as talking the talk and walking the walk, meaning that we often talk about conceptual ideas and beliefs being disseminated rather than walk with those ideas, meaning report products as those ideas are put into the practice. We think that simply talking, reporting about valuing something only makes a nod to the valued aim if it's not taken or tested in practice. However, we don't want to be too critical in this notion, as many of our authors also show in detail how teacher educators, together with their students, can make a difference in their learning. For example, Celia Euler and her colleagues draw attention to the students where teacher education is undertaken for social action. And they explore how students, teachers, and teacher educators together build unique relationships that exceed typical school-university partnerships. It is teacher education that works towards building a critical consciousness that enables teachers to integrate activism into their work and activism in their identities as teachers. Also in the article, Catherine Payne and Kevin Chidner show ways how communities can be part of teacher education by together seeking solutions to social justice problems affecting students, teacher candidates, schools and communities. And they advocate third spaces, as many of you know, where unofficial spaces in interaction with official spaces and discourses are included and supported. They also note barriers that make this move a very difficult one, but also show ways in which co-working towards a more relevant teacher education can take place. Now, as I come to close, I hope that the handbook manages to disrupt at least some fixed settings of doing teacher education research and doing teacher education in practice. As many chapters demonstrate the importance of studying teacher learning during teacher education, we look new pedagogical tools and methods to further support this broader attentiveness to learning in teacher education. We also look new directions in research that can help us to attend in many ways in which children, youth, teachers and teacher educators can understand learning simultaneously, albeit with their different learning goals. In this way and others, perhaps we can more clearly see or make connections between the multiple ways in which learning is occurring and the multiple people who are learning in teacher education. As we completed the handbook, we acknowledge that research on teacher education will not be able to offer explanatory and predictive theories. The research is a web of highly complex social phenomena, and research in teacher education is not done in order to build or develop theories, but it is done to contribute shared understandings that will help in clarifying where we are, where we want to go, and what is desirable according to the diverse set of values and interests in our societies. And this requires constant re-examination of our basic premises in and for teacher education. And we take up this point as we understand that what we are trying to do in teacher education research and for teacher education is not to come up with clear answers, solutions or theories, but it's to deepen our understanding of the complexities of how we are thinking about and engaging in the practices and policies of teacher education. It is research understood as searching again through these complex phenomena that allow us to come into new insights and hopefully also to wiser practices. Thank you. And as you know, all the famous books in Salamanca Library are kept behind the locked doors. And Juanja knows this because he has once shown us these very important books. And we all thank for you all coming yesterday to our garden party, where our intention was to show you some copies of our handbook, where you can see the cover here. But as all the important books, this was also behind the locked doors in a safe place yesterday, but now the doors have opened and we have received the copies of this handbook. You can find them outside this hall, and we are welcome to browse them and take a look. Thank you. How much time?
It's 10 minutes earlier.
Oh.
It's maybe people. You did a great job. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for the last words. You saved me.